In the closing months of World War II, the aftermath of global conflict stretched far beyond the formal signing of peace treaties. While victory was secured on both the European and Pacific fronts, the true cost of the war became evident in the rubble of cities, the crippled economies, and the wreckage of military might that would never again be used in battle. The world's naval forces, once mobilized at the height of the war, found themselves now confronting an entirely new challenge: what to do with the vast numbers of warships left stranded in the wake of combat. This was not simply a matter of retiring a fleet, but a struggle with the overwhelming reality of an excess of military assets that had no further purpose. The sunken warships, those scuttled intentionally to avoid capture or because of irreparable damage, became an emblem of that transition from war to peace. These vessels, the silent ghosts of naval history, would be abandoned, repurposed, or destroyed in the years that followed the war's end. The cessation of hostilities did not immediately lead to a sense of closure. Instead, the overwhelming logistical and financial pressure of rebuilding nations and redirecting resources toward peacetime industries created an environment where military expenditure and maintenance were no longer sustainable. The ships that had once been central to military strategies were now costly symbols of a bygone era. Naval forces across the world faced the difficult reality of surplus ships, some too damaged to salvage, others too outdated to maintain. In Europe, the wrecks of the warships that had once patrolled the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Baltic were a stark reminder of the conflict's legacy. For the Royal Navy, the British fleet had been decimated by both combat and the sustained wear of years at war. At the conclusion of hostilities, more than 130 ships had been sunk, and a substantial portion of them had to be either scuttled in place or dismantled. The Admiralty, straining under severe financial pressures, made the difficult decision to scrap a number of older warships, particularly those considered obsolete in the post-war era. The once mighty battleships like HMS King George V and HMS Howe were retired not in grand ceremonial fashion, but hastily put to rest in shipbreaking yards, their steel hulls hacked apart and sold as scrap metal to fuel the recovery efforts of an exhausted nation. The costs associated with maintaining these ships, along with the shifting priorities of defense, made their continued existence impossible. The looming specter of economic austerity, paired with the nascent Cold War tensions, led to a significant reduction in the British naval force. The situation in the United States was similar, though on a larger scale. The end of the war did not bring about a sudden halt to naval operations, but it did highlight the massive surplus of warships. The U.S. Navy had expanded its fleet to an unprecedented size during the conflict, but the looming peacetime economy was not equipped to support such a vast arsenal. Over 200 ships were either scuttled or sold for scrap in the years following the war. The Pacific, with its vast open waters, had been a battleground where battleships and aircraft carriers had once dominated. Now, in their final years, they would be stripped of valuable materials, metals, electronics, and specialized equipment, which could be reused in civilian industries. For some vessels, the post-war treatment was dictated not by their age or condition but by strategic necessity. Aircraft carriers, once the pride of the fleet, were particularly vulnerable to the sweeping tide of change. With the dawn of the jet age, many carriers were quickly deemed obsolete and placed on the chopping block. Some were sold off to foreign navies, while others were sunk in controlled operations. The USS Lexington, CV-16, an Essex-class carrier, was scuttled in 1947 as part of Operation Crossroads, a series of atomic bomb tests in the Pacific. The choice to use decommissioned ships as targets for nuclear tests, while offering a valuable opportunity to study the effects of atomic warfare, was also a stark symbol of the shift in naval priorities. In the Soviet Union, the fate of warships followed a somewhat different trajectory. While the USSR had managed to keep its navy in active service throughout much of the war, the end of the conflict presented a similar problem: surplus and outdated vessels. However, the Soviet approach was often more clandestine. Many ships that had been damaged beyond repair were abandoned in various ports, their wrecks left to rust and sink slowly over time. Others were cannibalized for parts, with usable equipment stripped away and repurposed for other projects. The vast expanse of the Soviet coastline, with its numerous secluded bays and inlets, offered a perfect environment for such quiet abandonment. Many of the sunken Soviet ships would remain lost for decades, only rediscovered years later, their identities obscured by layers of sediment and time. The fate of scuttled warships in the Pacific was equally complicated. In some cases, ships that had been disabled during the war were deliberately sunk to prevent their capture. The Japanese Imperial Navy, in particular, had taken measures to scuttle its warships in the closing days of the war, rendering many of its vessels unfit for salvage by the Allies. The aftermath of this deliberate scuttling would leave the waters around Japan littered with the remnants of its naval power. These vessels, once symbols of militaristic pride, would remain submerged for years, the scars of their final battles serving as grim markers in the waters of the Pacific. For other navies, particularly the smaller nations that had been caught in the conflict's wake, the cost of maintaining warships after the war was often prohibitive. Smaller fleets, particularly those in countries like France, Italy, and the Netherlands, had to contend with the realities of economic recovery. The French Navy, for instance, faced severe budgetary restrictions, forcing it to retire many of its ships. Some, like the battleship Jean Bart, had been scuttled in Casablanca to prevent them from falling into enemy hands during the war. Others, however, would end up in scrapyards, their lives cut short not by combat, but by financial necessity. The scene at shipbreaking yards in the immediate post-war period was one of industrial-scale destruction. These yards, scattered across the UK, the US, and parts of Europe, were the final resting places for thousands of vessels. Some of the ships, like the aircraft carriers and battleships of the Royal Navy, were still relatively young. Yet the economic realities of the post-war world made their continued existence untenable. Workers in the shipbreaking yards would spend months dismantling these colossal ships, their once proud forms reduced to scrap metal, sold for pennies on the pound, and melted down to be reborn as civilian infrastructure. This process was not only a financial decision, but a cultural one. The wrecking of these ships was a necessary part of the shift from wartime economies to peacetime industries. Yet for those who had lived through the war, it was a quiet end to an era of immense technological achievement and sacrifice. As the years passed, the fate of scuttled warships would continue to unfold in diverse ways. Some would be forgotten, their remnants lying deep beneath the waves. Others would be repurposed, reincarnated as artificial reefs, providing habitats for marine life. But for most, their story was one of obsolescence, redundancy, and the heavy burden of an economic and geopolitical world now focused on rebuilding and the realities of a post-war peace that could no longer afford the excesses of wartime. The fate of the sunken warships at the end of World War II was determined largely by economic and strategic imperatives, which were shaped by the tensions of the early Cold War, the destruction of wartime infrastructure, and the practical necessity of recovering valuable resources. After the initial period of uncertainty following the war, when some countries faced internal debates over whether to maintain or dismantle their naval forces, clear patterns began to emerge. Warships, particularly those that had been scuttled or abandoned, were assessed for their material worth, their strategic relevance, and their potential for future use in a world now focused on rebuilding rather than waging war. One of the most critical elements driving the decision to scuttle, scrap, or repurpose warships was the financial burden associated with maintaining large, obsolete fleets. As nations shifted focus to peacetime economies, the heavy maintenance costs of ships that had no immediate strategic value became untenable. Even for the United States, with its immense industrial and economic capacity, the prospect of maintaining a massive, post-war fleet seemed wasteful and impractical. The immediate need to demobilize, reduce military spending, and transition to a peacetime economy outweighed the desire to preserve aging ships. Thus, a substantial number of the U.S. Navy ships, from battleships to smaller vessels, were put on the scrap heap, contributing to the economic revival of the nation through the sale of valuable metals and parts. In the early years after the war, authorities made the difficult decision to scuttle or scrap a significant portion of their fleet, despite the ship's prior importance in the Pacific War. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers that had been central to naval operations in the Pacific were seen as outdated in the face of a new world order dominated by the threat of atomic weapons. The massive Iowa-class battleships, which had once been the backbone of the American naval fleet, were among the first to be placed on the scrap list. Their displacement and slow operational speed made them less suitable for the fast-moving, nuclear-powered future that military strategists began to envision. These ships were dismantled at scrapyards, their guns, radar systems, and hulls melted down and repurposed. However, even within the confines of a military and industrial society focused on peacetime recovery, the end of the war did not signal the complete end of these ships' utility. Some were given a second life in ways that reflected new geopolitical realities and the growing arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The larger, more formidable ships, such as the USS Saratoga, CV-3, and USS Lexington, CV-16, were used in atomic testing operations, most notably Operation Crossroads, which took place at Bikini Atoll in 1946. The choice to use these vessels as atomic bomb targets highlighted the transition from conventional naval warfare to the nuclear age. These tests, conducted by the U.S. military, offered valuable insights into the destructive potential of atomic bombs, and the scuttling of the ships was a symbol of the rapid obsolescence of the old order in the face of new technological advancements. While some ships were used as targets for nuclear tests, others found new roles as part of a growing tradition of utilizing decommissioned vessels for marine conservation efforts. In the years following the war, several nations began sinking ships intentionally to create artificial reefs. This was particularly true of smaller vessels that had no military value but were still too large to be efficiently dismantled. The sinking of these ships in designated areas off coastlines became a form of ecological repurposing, turning former warships into ecosystems that supported marine life. While this was not the primary goal at the time, the idea of converting sunken warships into artificial reefs would later gain popularity as part of environmental and conservation efforts. This decision represented a quiet evolution in how society viewed the remnants of war, no longer merely as metal hulks to be destroyed, but as potential sources of life in a rapidly changing world. In Europe, the fate of scuttled and abandoned warships mirrored the practices in the United States but was complicated by the deeply fractured post-war landscape. The United Kingdom, for example, faced a severe lack of resources. While the Royal Navy had once been the largest and most powerful fleet in the world, by the time the war ended, Britain was economically exhausted. The decision to scrap ships such as the HMS Prince of Wales, HMS Repulse, and others, which had once been considered symbols of British naval supremacy, was a direct consequence of this economic and material strain. The British government had to balance the demands of post-war reconstruction with the costs of maintaining a navy that was no longer central to the country's geopolitical position. Even though Britain had a vested interest in preserving its naval identity, the reality of resource scarcity and the shifting global order meant that many ships, particularly those damaged during the war, would never sail again. The Royal Navy's shipbreaking efforts were also complicated by the political and military atmosphere of the time. In the face of rising tensions with the Soviet Union, there was a continued focus on maintaining naval superiority, but Britain's resources were finite. Some ships, such as those that had been severely damaged and were beyond economic repair, were sold for scrap metal, while others were sunk deliberately to prevent them from being captured by the enemy. The sight of once proud vessels being reduced to scrap was a symbol of the enduring weight of war, an unwelcome reminder that even the mightiest of ships could fall prey to the inescapable realities of the post-war world. In the Pacific, the situation was no less complex. The Pacific Islands, where many of the most famous naval battles had taken place, were now dotted with wrecks of ships scuttled by both the Japanese and the Allied forces. These ships were not just abandoned, they were often deliberately sunk to prevent them from being salvaged by the enemy. Many of the ships scuttled at the end of the war had been heavily damaged during the conflict and were considered too costly to repair. The Japanese Navy, in particular, had taken steps to scuttle its fleet rather than let it fall into Allied hands. The wrecks of the Yamato, Musashi, and other massive warships became submerged monuments to Japan's naval might, slowly decaying in the depths of the Pacific. Some would eventually be rediscovered, raising debates about whether they should be preserved, salvaged, or left undisturbed as underwater memorials. The sunken warships that dotted the seabed, particularly in the Pacific, were a reminder that the end of the war did not bring a clean break from its consequences. The loss of these vessels marked a permanent shift in naval power. For the United States and other victorious nations, the post-war period was one of rebuilding and redefining military strategy. The need to manage surplus ships and adapt to new technologies led to the rapid dismantling of much of the pre-war naval infrastructure, which in turn paved the way for the introduction of the nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers that would dominate the military landscape for decades to come. Not all ships were scrapped or sunk, however. Some found new roles in foreign navies, given as military aid to countries that lacked the resources to build their own fleets. This process of repurposing warships also extended to their use in training operations and other auxiliary functions. For example, the Soviet Union, despite having a massive fleet of its own, took advantage of surplus ships from the United States and the United Kingdom, using them as training vessels or for secondary roles within their own navy. This reflected the complexities of the post-war arms race, where even old warships could find new purposes in the geopolitical context of the early Cold War.